And we begin tonight with the saga of Stormy Daniels, a story that started a long time ago in 2006, to be exact. It was the year adult film actress Daniels, whose legal name is Stephanie Clifford, said she met Donald Trump at a celebrity golf tournament and that the two allegedly began an affair. Trump was married to Melania by then. Daniels was 27 years old at the time, and Trump was 60. There had been whispers of the affair for a while. Remember, Trump was a real estate mogul and tabloid darling back then. But what was once gossipy tea became a problem, a huge problem, when Trump, the Apprentice star, became Trump, the American president. In 2018, the Wall Street Journal reported that longtime Trump fixer Michael Cohen had arranged a $130,000 payment before the 2016 election as part of an agreement that precluded Daniels from publicly discussing her sexual encounters with Trump. Hush payoffs were also used to silence former Playboy model Karen McDougal, another one of Trump's alleged mistresses. Is it illegal to pay off an ex-girlfriend? Does it mean you cannot be president? No, of course not. But Daniels was paid during Trump's presidential run and just 1 month before Election Day, making the payments a campaign finance violation, which of course was a big problem too for Michael Cohen. According to the Journal's sources, it was he who arranged the payment to Daniels in October 2016 after her lawyer negotiated the non-disclosure agreement with Cohen. Cohen was given a 3-year prison sentence after pleading guilty to crimes that included facilitating those payments, as well as other financial crimes. But according to accounts, Trump himself was involved directly in each deal, with Trump reportedly telling Cohen to get it done. Trump denies all of this, of course, a rebuttal that means nothing, especially given what Cohen testified to before Congress before entering prison.
Mr. Trump is a con man. He asked me to pay off an adult film star with whom he had an affair. And this was days before the election that Mr. Trump was going to pay the $130,000. In the office with me was Alan Weisselberg, the chief financial officer of the Trump Organization. He acknowledged to Alan that he was going to pay the $130,000. And that Alan and I should go back to his office and figure out how to do it.
Michael Cohen had gone from Trump's fixer to Trump's enemy. And Stormy Daniels may still be the one to take Trump down, because last night was one of those blockbuster breaking news kind of nights that renew your faith in karma. The New York Times reported that the Manhattan District Attorney's Office recently signaled to Trump's lawyers that he could face criminal charges for his role in paying Daniels to keep things under wraps. If those charges are made, it would be the first indictment of a former U.S. president. It's kind of bonkers when you think about it. How one of the earliest probes against Trump is nearing its final stages. But make no mistake, Trump's attorneys are working hard to scrape the dirt off of Teflon Don. Late today, NBC News reported that the attorneys representing Trump in this case are meeting Trump in Florida to discuss an exit strategy. Trump attorney Joe Tacopina told NBC News they have no plans on meeting with the Manhattan DA's office and insist that Trump is the victim of extortion. Also today, Trump loyalist turned nemesis Michael Cohen made his 20th and final appearance with Manhattan prosecutors. The 7-hour meeting was in preparation for his grand jury appearance, which will be Monday at 2 p.m. Joining me now is Harry Litman, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General, Senior Legal Affairs columnist for the Los Angeles Times, and host of the Talking Feds podcast, along with Nick Ackerman, former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York and former Assistant Special Watergate Prosecutor. Harry Litman, I do want to start with you because, you know, here's the question, I guess, the easiest question, because Donald Trump has used a lot of legal maneuvers to get out of a lot of things. He's ignored subpoenas. He's gotten away with a lot over the course of his life. Is there some way that his attorney, Joe Tacopina, could somehow create an exit strategy that would avoid prosecution? Is it too late, without going and testifying before this grand jury, to somehow convince the grand jury or the prosecutor to stand down?
Even if he goes to testify, Joy, it's too late. They've already made the decision, and it would just be a kind of a suicide mission where he would try his best. Very few defendants would take that opportunity, and Donald Trump would not be one of them. You know, stranger things have happened, but I'm confident in saying an indictment is coming and soon. I don't believe it when they say the Trump lawyers won't try to talk. No chance Trump goes in to testify. The Trump lawyers may still try to meet to talk Bragg out of it. That could take a week or two. Otherwise, this and the other big signal, as you just reported, Cohen testifying on Monday, that's the final step. And then you give Trump the chance. He won't take it. It is 100 times out of 100 a sign that an indictment is coming next.
Wow. Okay. Well, that is very definitive. Nick Ackerman, the only other time, that anything close to this has happened, obviously, is Richard Nixon's Attorney General Spiro Agnew, who resigned as a result of being indicted. I think it was tax-related offenses. But that's the only other time, but that was a very different atmosphere. I mean, Nixon was like a different version of Trump, but, he didn't have a cult, So, I mean, can you just talk about sort of the political atmospheres then and now, and how you think, how much would this explode the universe if this indictment happened, as it seems to me Harry Litman said it's gonna?
Well, I think it is. I think Harry's absolutely correct that there will be an indictment here. I mean, if you compare this to Watergate, don't forget, Richard Nixon was about to be impeached. He was impeached. He would have been removed by the Senate. We basically held back. We didn't indict because of that. We basically deferred to the Congress on impeachment process. But here, I think what's going to happen is going to be much more explosive politically. It's going to completely change the game, because once Trump is been indicted, I don't care what he says about still running for president, being under an indictment is not a positive resume builder. And you're going to find that other people who've been holding back, most notably Vice President Pence and Mr. Pompeo and others, are suddenly going to jump into the race because they're going to feel a lot more confident that they've got a chance. Because I think at that point, what U.S. senators, what congressmen are going to want to run for re-election in 2024 with the head of the ticket under indictment? I mean, it's not only unprecedented, but politically it's going to be disastrous for the rest of the ticket, right down to dog catcher. So that is going to make a big difference. And I think the person who may benefit the most out of this is Vice President Pence. If you look at modern history, it's been the vice president who's gotten the nomination, whether it was Eisenhower, Nixon, Johnson, Humphrey, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Gore, and of course now President Biden. So wow. I think it's really going to mix up the entire political world once this happens.
Wow. And just to be clear, the OLC type memo that says you can't indict a sitting president, if he then gets indicted at the state level inside the DOJ, I guess I'll ask both of you this question. How does the DOJ then look at that? Because there are all these other things like that a lot of people would argue are more important. There is the January 6th case, Harry. There is the case that's in Georgia about interfering with Georgia's election. There's obviously the financial crimes case that you could still see Tish James looking at in New York. But I mean, some of these bigger cases, especially the Jack Smith investigation, as a former federal prosecutor, what happens with those cases if he's indicted in the state of New York?
Okay, first, all true. I do want to say to Nick's point, we should have our expectations a little bit tempered, because a lot's going to happen after an indictment here, and it will be months, maybe up to a year of just pretrial stuff. And second, while that is the recent history, Trump is certainly suggesting bring it on, and this will only inflame his supporters more. The short answer to what happens with Smith and DOJ is nothing. They go on their same track and their road. There is no. I think it maybe affects Fulton County, but I don't see it affecting DOJ. And an important point to know: not only does the OLC memo not apply, neither, of course, is a pardon possible, because it's a state offense. So that magic kryptonite power is gone.
Let me just stay with you for just a second, Harry, because the things that people have brought up as impediments to this kind of a prosecution. Number one, Michael Cohen. They're saying, well, they'll try to impeach his credibility. There were some tax issues that he was also convicted for, some evading taxes on a few million dollars in income, and some other things like that, including this campaign finance violation. But I would note that he's not been wrong yet. Let me just play a quick montage. These are things that Michael Cohen has said that have all proved to be true. Take a look.
It was my experience that Mr. Trump inflated his total assets when it served his purposes, such as trying to be listed amongst the wealthiest people in Forbes, and deflated his assets to reduce his real estate taxes. He is a racist. He is a con man. And he is a cheat. Given my experience working for Mr. Trump, I fear that if he loses the election in 2020, that there will never be a peaceful transition of power.
Show me the lie. He's been right again. He's been unassailable as a witness before Congress. Everything he said has been true. If you have people like me on the jury, I'd be like, yeah, I believe him. Do you think they could impeach him despite that?
Well, look, there'll be things to say, but he won't be the first star witness that has a criminal record, for example. And I think one of the most important things that Bragg's been trying to do over the last few months is figure out how to bolster his credibility. And last week we had Hope Hicks, we've had Kellyanne Conway. They're connected at important junctures, as Cohen has testified. I think that's what they're doing there. And Bragg, before he brings an indictment, and he's decided to, has concluded he's got enough to bolster Cohen's credibility. Of course, they'll come after him at trial, but he won't be acting alone. And not just him, paper record of the mischaracterization of the income, and then Kellyanne Conway, Hope Hicks, maybe others to bolster important points. And as you say, he certainly hasn't been wrong in recent history.